They said he would never see the light, never see his mother's face, never see the world. But on a cold November morning, when a 7-year-old girl with dirt under her fingernails leaned close and whispered a single word into his ear, the impossible happened. His eyes opened, and with them a secret 20 years buried came screaming back to life. The first cry that escaped baby Alexander, Thornton's lungs on that March evening was strong enough to shake the crystal chandelier in the hospital's private wing. But his eyes remained closed, not the gentle closed of a sleeping newborn, but something else entirely, something wrong. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had delivered over 3,000 babies in her 30-year career, but she'd never seen anything like this. The boy's eyelids were sealed shut, fused together as if his body had decided sight was a luxury it couldn't afford. She'd seen birth defects before, complications that made parents weep and futures uncertain. But this was different. Marcus Thornton, CEO of Thornton Industries and one of the wealthiest men in New York, stood frozen beside his wife's hospital bed. His empire stretched across continents. His name opened doors that remained locked to others. His wealth could buy almost anything. Almost the baby's mother. Victoria reached for her son with trembling hands. Even through the fog of exhaustion and medication, she understood what the doctors weren't saying. The way they avoided eye contact, the hushed consultations in the corner of the room, the careful neutrality of their expressions. For 3 days, specialists flew in from around the world. London, Tokyo, Geneva. Each one examined the infant, with instruments that cost more than most people's homes. Each one left with the same conclusion. The optic nerves were there, perfectly formed. The eyes themselves appeared structurally sound. But something at the cellular level, something they couldn't identify or explain, prevented those tiny eyelids from opening. Marcus threw money at the problem, the way he'd solved every other obstacle in his life. A research team, a private facility, the best pediatric ophthalmologists money could hire. He bought a mansion in Connecticut, away from the city's prying eyes, away from the reporters who'd already started calling his son the blind billionaire baby. The years passed like water through cupped hands. Alexander grew from infant to toddler to child, navigating his world through touch and sound and smell. He learned to walk by following the echo of his footsteps off marble floors. He learned to recognize people by their breathing patterns. His father by the sharp click of Italian leather shoes. His mother by the soft rustle of silk and the vanilla scent of her perfume. By the time Alexander turned 7, Marcus had spent $43 million on treatments, experimental surgeries, stem cell therapy, genetic manipulation, neural implants. Each one promised hope. Each one delivered nothing but disappointment and risk. Victoria watched her husband transform from a man who built empires into a man consumed by a single impossible goal. His hair went gray at the temples. Lines carved themselves around his mouth. He stopped sleeping in their bedroom, choosing instead to spend nights in his study, surrounded by medical journals and research papers he barely understood. The mansion became a prison of privilege. Nurses walked the hallways. Therapists came and went. Alexander's childhood was scheduled down to 15-minute increments. Physical therapy at 9, Braille lessons at 10, music instruction at 2. His parents had decided that if he couldn't see the world, he would at least master it through every other sense. But Alexander didn't want to master anything. He wanted to see his mother's face just once. He wanted to know what the sun looked like when it rose over the Connecticut hills. He wanted to understand why people cried when they looked at paintings, or why his father's voice caught when he talked about the view from his office on the 68th floor. On a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 7 years and 8 months after Alexander's birth, everything changed. Not because of medicine or money or miracles, but because of a girl named Emma Santos. Emma lived in the gardener's cottage at the edge of the Thornton estate. Her father, Miguel, had worked for the family for 6 years, maintaining the 12 acres of manicured lawns and imported rose gardens. Emma and her father had moved up from Texas after her mother died, chasing a job that paid enough to keep food on the table and a roof overhead. She'd seen the big house from a distance, had caught glimpses of the blind boy through windows. The other staff whispered about him, about the doctors who came and went, about the father who never smiled, about the mother who walked the gardens at dawn, crying when she thought no one could see. Emma didn't understand why rich people seemed so sad. In her 7 years of life, she'd known poverty and loss and hunger. But she'd also known laughter. Her father sang while he worked, terrible off-key Spanish songs that made her giggle. They ate dinner together every night, just the two of them, trading stories about their days. That November morning, Emma had followed a monarch butterfly through the garden. She'd been chasing it for nearly 15 minutes, watching the orange and black wings dance through the autumn air. The butterfly led her right up to an open window on the mansion's ground floor. Emma knew she wasn't supposed to be near the house. Her father had been very clear about that. The Thorntons valued their privacy. The boy especially wasn't to be disturbed. But the butterfly had landed on the windowsill, and Emma couldn't resist peeking inside. Alexander sat alone in the music room, his small fingers resting on piano keys he couldn't see. He was humming something soft and sad. Even at 7, Emma understood loneliness when she saw it. She didn't think, didn't plan. She just climbed through the window with the easy fearlessness of a child who'd spent her life scrambling up trees and over fences. Her worn sneakers made no sound on the expensive carpet. Alexander's head turned toward her. He couldn't see her, but he'd heard something. A breath, a small movement of air. Who's there? His voice was quiet, uncertain. He'd been trained never to raise his voice, never to seem ungrateful for all the care and attention. Emma walked closer. She'd never been this near to him before. He was small for 7, thin in a way that suggested he didn't spend much time running or playing. His hair was dark and neat, cut by someone who understood expensive haircuts. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were closed just as everyone said. But there was something else. Something in the way his face turned towards sound, the way his expression shifted and changed. He wasn't broken. He was just trapped. "I'm Emma," she said simply. "I live in the cottage. My dad takes care of the gardens." Alexander's shoulders relaxed slightly. A child, someone his own age. He couldn't remember the last time he'd talked to another kid. The nurses and therapists and doctors were all adults, all professional, all carefully neutral. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. "Just curiosity. I know." Emma moved closer still. "I was chasing a butterfly." "Are you really blind?" The question was direct in the way only children can be direct. No pity, no careful dancing around the truth, just honest curiosity. "Yes," Alexander said. "I've never seen anything." "Not ever." Emma tilted her head, studying his face. Back home in Texas, her abuela used to tell stories about miracles and faith and the power of words spoken with true belief. Emma had mostly forgotten those stories after her mother died. But standing in this quiet room, looking at this sad boy with sealed eyes, the memories came flooding back. Her grandmother had told her once that some people carried magic in their blood without knowing it. That sometimes the right word spoken at the right moment could change everything. Emma didn't know if she believed in magic, but she believed in trying. She stepped forward until she was right beside Alexander's chair. He could probably hear her heartbeat. She was so close. "Can I tell you something?" she whispered. Alexander nodded, his face turned toward her voice. Emma leaned in close, so close her breath touched his ear. And then she whispered a single word. One word that made no sense. One word that shouldn't have meant anything. Miracle. No, that wasn't it. That wasn't the word she said. She whispered something else. Something that had been locked away in her memory, buried deep where even she didn't know to look for it. She whispered, "Mama." And Alexander Thornton's eyes opened for the first time in his life. The sensation was overwhelming. Light crashed into Alexander's consciousness like a wave breaking against rocks. Colors he had no names for flooded his brain. Shapes and shadows and the sudden, terrifying understanding of depth and distance. He screamed, not from pain, but from the sheer impossibility of processing 7 years of blindness ending in a single instant. His hands flew to his face, and for the first time, he could see his own fingers. 5 digits attached to a small hand that looked pale and fragile in the afternoon light streaming through the window. Emma stumbled backward, her own eyes wide with shock. What had just happened? What had she done? The word had come from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere she didn't understand. It felt like remembering a dream after waking, or fragments and feelings with no clear origin. Alexander's screaming brought footsteps thundering down the hallway. The door burst open, and Marcus Thornton appeared. followed closely by 2 nurses and Victoria, who'd been reading in the library. Marcus saw his son with his hands over his face, saw a strange little girl backing away toward the window, and his brain tried to make sense of the scene. But before he could speak, before he could demand explanations or call security, Alexander lowered his hands and looked at his father. Victoria's knees buckled. She caught herself against the doorframe, one hand pressed to her mouth. Marcus stood frozen. His entire empire-building, deal-making, never-show-weakness composure shattered completely. Alexander's eyes were open, wide and dark and seeing. They moved from his father to his mother, to the nurses who stood slack-jawed in the doorway, and then they found Emma, still pressed against the wall beside the window. "You," he whispered, his voice rough from screaming. "I can see you." The next hours were chaos. Doctors descended on the mansion like a medical storm. Dr. Hendricks, who delivered Alexander 7 years ago, arrived by helicopter. Specialists were pulled from dinner parties and theater performances and family gatherings. They examined Alexander with instruments and questions, and an intensity that bordered on disbelief. His eyes were open, fully open. The eyelids that had been fused shut since birth now moved normally, blinking when bright lights were shined in them, responding to every stimulus exactly as they should. The optic nerves were functioning. The retinas were healthy. By every measurable standard, Alexander Thornton could see, but none of them could explain how or why, or what had changed in the split second between blindness and sight. Emma had been moved to a sitting room with her father, who'd been brought up from the cottage in a panic. Miguel held his daughter's hand tightly, trying to understand what she'd been doing in the main house, what had happened, why his employer looked at Emma with an expression that mixed gratitude with something else, something that might have been fear. Marcus Thornton was a man who dealt in facts and figures and tangible results. He didn't believe in miracles or magic or divine intervention, but he'd just watched his son's impossible condition reverse itself for no medical reason. And the only variable, the only thing that had changed, was the presence of a 7-year-old gardener's daughter. He stood in the sitting room doorway looking at Emma. She was small and thin, wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt that had been washed so many times, the cartoon character on it was barely visible. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her sneakers had holes in them. She was everything his world wasn't. Poor, simple, unremarkable, except she'd done what $43 million and the world's best doctors couldn't do. "What did you say to him?" Marcus asked. His voice was controlled, but Emma could hear the tremor underneath. "What did you whisper?" Emma looked at her father, then back at the tall man in the expensive suit. She wanted to tell the truth, but the truth was she wasn't entirely sure. The word had come from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere that felt like a memory that wasn't quite hers. "I said, Mama," she answered quietly. Marcus's face went white, actually white, like all the blood had drained out of it in a single instant. He gripped the doorframe so hard his knuckles turned the same colorless shade. Miguel felt his daughter's hand tighten in his. He didn't understand what was happening, but he understood fear. And his employer looked terrified. "Why?" Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Why did you say that word?" Emma shrugged, a small movement of narrow shoulders. "I don't know. It just felt right. Like it was the right word to say." Victoria appeared behind her husband. She'd been with Alexander, watching as doctors continued their examinations. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was joy there too. 7 years of grief and hope and desperate prayer had just been answered in the most impossible way. She looked at Emma, really looked at her for the first time, at the shape of her face, the darkness of her hair, the particular curve of her cheekbone. Victoria's hand flew to her throat. She took a step back, then another, until she hit the wall behind her. "Marcus," she breathed. "Marcus, look at her." But Marcus was already looking. He was seeing what his wife had just seen. The resemblance that shouldn't be there. The features that echoed someone else's face, someone from a long time ago. Miguel stood up, pulling Emma behind him in a protective gesture. Something was very wrong. These rich people were looking at his daughter like she was a ghost, and he didn't understand why. "What's going on?" Miguel's English was accented but clear. "My daughter didn't do anything wrong. She just talked to the boy." Marcus seemed to shake himself. He straightened his tie, pulled his composure back around himself like armor. When he spoke, his voice was almost normal again. Of course. Emma did nothing wrong. In fact, she's given us a miracle. Miguel, I'd like to speak with you and your daughter tomorrow morning. In my study, there are things we need to discuss. It wasn't a request. Miguel had worked for wealthy people long enough to know the difference between an invitation and a command. He nodded slowly. Good. Marcus turned to leave, then paused. Emma, thank you. For helping my son, we're grateful. But Emma saw the way his hands shook as he walked away. She saw the look Victoria gave her before following her husband. This wasn't gratitude. This was something else. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. Not from excitement, though he was excited. Not from fear, though the newness of sight was terrifying. He couldn't sleep because he kept seeing Emma's face every time he closed his eyes. She'd been the first person he'd ever seen. The first face his brain had learned to recognize. He got out of bed, moving carefully through a room he could now navigate by sight instead of memory. The moonlight coming through his window painted everything in silver and shadow. He could see it. Actually see it. His mother was standing in the hallway outside his room. She jumped when she saw him, pressing a hand to her chest. Alexander, sweetheart, you should be sleeping. I can't. He looked up at her, really seeing his mother's face for the first time. She was beautiful. Sad but beautiful. Mom, why did Dad look so scared when Emma said that word? Victoria knelt down to her son's level. In the dim light, her eyes glistened with tears she was trying to hold back. Sometimes, sweetheart, the past comes back in ways we don't expect. And sometimes people we thought we'd never see again find their way back to us. I don't understand. Victoria pulled her son into a hug, holding him tight enough that Alexander could feel her heartbeat. It was fast and irregular, like she'd been running. You will, she whispered into his hair. Tomorrow, when your father tells you the truth. The truth he's been hiding for 20 years. She pulled back, looking at her son's open eyes in the moonlight. Get some sleep, Alexander. Tomorrow is going to change everything, again. But sleep wouldn't come. Not for Alexander in his room. Not for Emma in the cottage, who kept seeing the terror on the rich man's face. Not for Miguel, who'd heard something in his employer's voice that sounded like guilt. Not for Victoria, who stood at her bedroom window and looked out at the cottage where a ghost lived. And certainly not for Marcus Thornton, who sat in his study with a locked drawer open in front of him. Inside the drawer was a photograph, 20 years old, creased at the corners, showing a young woman, with dark hair and a smile that could light up a room, a woman whose face was identical to the 7-year-old girl who'd just given his son sight, a woman named Maria Santos, a woman Marcus Thornton had loved before he married Victoria, a woman who'd died 20 years ago, or so everyone thought. Miguel Santos arrived at Marcus Thornton's study at precisely 9 in the morning, holding Emma's hand. His daughter wore her best dress, a simple blue thing that Victoria had given them last Christmas. Miguel had polished her shoes until they shined. Whatever this meeting was about, he wanted Emma to look her best. Marcus sat behind a desk that cost more than Miguel made in a year. The morning light caught the edges of the photograph he'd been staring at for the past 3 hours. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything but wrestle with a truth he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it wasn't real. Victoria stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She'd known. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand why her husband's face had gone white when Emma spoke. Enough to recognize the ghost sitting in her gardens. Please sit, Marcus gestured to the chairs across from his desk. His voice was hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. Miguel sat, pulling Emma close to his side. The child's eyes were wide, taking in the room full of leather-bound books and expensive art. She'd never been in this part of the house before. Marcus pushed the photograph across the desk. Miguel, have you ever seen this woman? Miguel picked up the photo with calloused hands. The moment he saw the face, his entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face the same way it had drained from Marcus's the day before. Where did you get this? Miguel's voice shook. How do you have this? You know her. It wasn't a question. Miguel's reaction had already confirmed what Marcus needed to know. This is Maria, Miguel whispered. My wife, Emma's mother. He looked up, confusion and pain and something like anger warring in his expression. But how? How do you have a picture of Maria? Emma leaned over to look at the photograph her father held. She'd only been 3 when her mother died. Her memories were fragments and feelings more than clear images, but she recognized the face. It was like looking at an older version of herself. Marcus stood and walked to the window, standing beside Victoria. When he spoke, his voice carried 20 years of regret. 23 years ago, I was different. Young, arrogant, convinced I could have anything I wanted. My father had just died, left me the company. I was drowning in responsibility and grief. That's when I met Maria. He turned to look at Miguel. She worked at a coffee shop near my office in Manhattan. I'd stop by every morning. At first, it was just for the coffee. Then it was to see her smile. Then it was because I couldn't imagine starting my day any other way. Victoria's jaw clenched. She'd known her husband had a past. Everyone did. But hearing the tenderness in his voice when he talked about another woman made something twist in her chest. We fell in love, Marcus continued. Or at least I thought we did. For 6 months, she was everything. We'd meet after her shifts, walk through Central Park, talk about the future. I told her about my company, my dreams. She told me about growing up in Texas, about wanting to go to college someday, about her family. Miguel's hands tightened on the photograph. Maria never mentioned you. Never said anything about a man named Marcus Thornton. Because I was a coward, Marcus said flatly. My mother found out about Maria, investigated her, discovered she was an undocumented immigrant, working illegally in the country. My mother gave me an ultimatum. End it, or she'd make sure Maria was deported. Emma felt her father's hand tighten around hers. She was starting to understand that this story was about her mother, about a life before she was born. I chose wrong, Marcus's voice cracked. I told myself I was protecting her, that if I ended things, my mother would leave her alone, so I broke it off. Told Maria I couldn't see her anymore. Didn't explain why. Just walked away. He turned back to face Miguel and Emma. 2 months later, I heard she'd been deported anyway. My mother had made sure of it. By then, I was engaged to Victoria. Our families had arranged it. A merger of empires disguised as love. I told myself Maria was better off without me. That she'd go back to Texas and build a real life. She did, Miguel said quietly. She went back to San Antonio. That's where I met her 3 years later. She was working 2 jobs, saving money for night school. We got married. Had Emma. She never talked about New York, never mentioned she'd been deported. I thought she'd just decided to come home. Marcus nodded. I never forgot her. Even married Victoria, had Alexander, built my empire. But Maria was always there in the back of my mind. The road not taken. The life I was too weak to choose. Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the pain. When did you find out she died? 4 years ago, Miguel answered. Car accident. Emma was only 3. He pulled his daughter closer. It destroyed me. But I had to keep going for Emma. That's why we moved around so much. Trying to find work. Trying to build something stable for my daughter. Marcus walked back to his desk and opened another drawer. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents and photographs. After I heard about the deportation, I tried to find Maria, hired investigators. They found records of her return to Texas, her marriage to you, Emma's birth, and then, 4 years ago, the death certificate. He looked at Miguel. I've been tracking your movements ever since. When you applied for the gardener position 6 years ago, I approved it personally. I brought you here to Connecticut because I wanted Emma close. I wanted to see Maria's daughter, to know that some piece of her still existed in the world. Miguel stood up so fast his chair fell backward. You've been watching us, tracking my daughter? Not like that, Marcus said quickly. I just wanted to help. The salary I pay you is 3 times the market rate for estate gardeners. The cottage, the medical insurance, Emma's school enrollment. I've been trying to take care of you both, in the only way I could without revealing the truth. The truth, Victoria interjected, her voice sharp. Why don't you tell them all of it, Marcus? Tell them why you really brought them here. Marcus's shoulders sagged. When Alexander was born blind, I was desperate. I researched everything. Genetics, hereditary conditions, anything that might explain his condition. That's when I found it, buried in my own family history. He pulled out another document from the folder. My great-grandmother had the same condition. Born with fused eyelids. She was blind her entire life. It was a recessive genetic disorder, so rare that most doctors have never seen a case. It only manifests under specific genetic circumstances. What does this have to do with Maria? Miguel asked, though there was a tremor in his voice that suggested he already knew. The research I found suggested that in the few documented cases of this condition, there was sometimes a genetic key, a specific DNA marker from the maternal line that could trigger the eyelids to open. The cases were so rare, the science so uncertain, that most medical professionals dismissed it as superstition. Marcus looked at Emma. But I wondered, if Maria and I had a child together, if that child carried both our genetic markers, could she be the key to unlocking Alexander's sight? The room went completely silent. Emma looked between the adults, trying to understand the heavy weight of what was being said. Miguel's voice was deadly quiet. "Are you saying Emma is your daughter?" "No," Marcus said quickly. "I'm saying I wondered if she could have been." I knew the timeline. Maria was deported 2 months after we broke up. "You met her 3 years after that. There's no way Emma is mine biologically." He paused. "But yesterday when she whispered Mama and Alexander's eyes opened, I realized something. It wasn't about genetics. It was about connection, about love, about the invisible threads that tie us to people we've lost." Victoria moved to stand beside Emma. She knelt down, looking at the little girl with tears streaming down her face. "You have your mother's gift, sweetheart. Maria had it too. The ability to see what others can't. To know things without knowing how you know them." "I don't understand," Emma whispered. "Maria came to see me," Victoria said softly. 3 months before she was deported. She found out I was engaged to Marcus. She stood outside this very house and looked up at the windows. I saw her from my bedroom. I was curious, so I went down to talk to her." Victoria's voice broke. "She told me she was pregnant. That Marcus's child was growing inside her. She said she wasn't there to cause trouble or ask for money. She just wanted me to know that part of him would survive, even if they couldn't be together." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to unsee once revealed. Miguel's face went from white to grey. "What?" "I didn't believe her at first," Victoria continued. "But she knew things about Marcus, intimate things only a lover would know. She was telling the truth." Victoria looked at Marcus with something between pity and rage. "I never told you. I should have, but I was young and scared and selfish. I wanted you for myself." Marcus gripped the edge of his desk. "If Maria was pregnant, then Emma is your daughter," Miguel finished, his voice hollow. "Maria was 3 months pregnant when we met. She told me the father had died. An accident. I never questioned it. I loved her, and I loved Emma as my own from the moment she was born." Emma looked up at the tall man behind the desk. At Marcus Thornton, billionaire empire builder, the man who'd been watching her from shadows for years, her biological father. The silence in the study was absolute. Outside, birds sang in the gardens Miguel tended. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. But inside that room, time had stopped completely. Emma pulled away from her father, from Miguel, the man who'd raised her and loved her and been there for every scraped knee and bad dream. She walked to the center of the room, looking at each adult in turn. "My mama," she said quietly, "told me something before she died. I was only 3, but I remember. She said I had a piece of her heart and a piece of someone else's. She said that someday I'd understand what that meant." Emma turned to Marcus. "She also said that if I ever met a boy who couldn't see, I should tell him the word that meant love. That's why I whispered Mama, because that's what love meant to me. It was the word that made me feel safe." Tears streamed down Marcus's face. A man who'd spent decades hiding emotion, controlling every reaction, was openly weeping. She knew. "Somehow Maria knew you'd meet Alexander." "Maybe," Emma said with the simple wisdom children sometimes possess. "Or maybe she just knew I'd meet someone who needed help. That's what mamas do, right? They help." Alexander appeared in the doorway. He'd been listening from the hallway, understanding some things and not others, but knowing his world had shifted completely. He could see Emma now, really see her. And what he saw was a girl who looked like she could be his sister. Because she was, Emma. Alexander's voice was small. "Does this mean we're family?" Emma looked at the boy with the now open eyes. She thought about her mother, about the secrets adults keep, about the complicated ways people love each other. Then she nodded. "Yeah," she said. "I guess it does." Miguel stood slowly. His whole world had been rewritten in the space of an hour. The woman he'd loved, the child he'd raised, the life he'd built, all of it was different now. Not worse, not better, just different. Emma, he said carefully, is still my daughter. I don't care about blood or genetics or who her biological father is. I've been her dad for 7 years. That doesn't change. No, Marcus agreed quickly, desperately. It doesn't change. You're her father, Miguel. You've earned that title every single day. I'm just a man who made terrible choices a long time ago. Victoria moved to stand beside her husband. For all the pain and betrayal and years of unknowing, she could see the truth now. Marcus hadn't known about Emma. He'd lost Maria without understanding what he'd lost, and she, Victoria, had kept a secret that might have changed everything. We're all broken here, she said softly. All of us carrying secrets and regrets. But maybe that little girl just showed us how to start healing. She looked at Emma. You gave my son sight. Not through magic or miracles, though it felt like both. You gave it to him through love, through connection, through being exactly who you are. Over the next days and weeks, the truth settled into all their lives like snow accumulating on branches. Some conversations were had. Others were left for another time, when the wounds weren't quite so fresh. Miguel stayed on as the estate gardener, but now he and Emma had dinner at the main house twice a week. Alexander and Emma played together in the gardens, 2 children discovering friendship and siblinghood in equal measure. She taught him to climb trees by sight instead of feel. He taught her piano, the one thing his blindness had made him master. Marcus and Miguel developed a careful respect. They'd never be friends, not really. The history was too complicated, the hurt too deep, but they could be civil. They could share coffee while watching their children laugh. They could acknowledge that sometimes life tangles people together in ways nobody planned. Victoria found herself drawn to Emma in ways she hadn't expected. The girl reminded her of a younger, more hopeful version of herself, someone who hadn't yet learned to hide emotion behind expensive clothes and perfect posture. She started teaching Emma things: how to set a formal table, how to read financial reports, how to navigate a world that often underestimated women. But it was Alexander and Emma who changed the most. The boy who'd never seen the world learned to see it through his sister's eyes. She showed him beauty in simple things, butterflies and sunsets and the way light caught in morning dew. He showed her complexity, music theory and classic literature and the mathematics that governed everything. The doctors never did figure out exactly what had happened. Dr. Hendricks wrote it up as a spontaneous remission of an unknown condition. The medical journals published her findings alongside speculation and skepticism. But Alexander's eyes stayed open, functional, perfect. 6 months after that November morning, Marcus called Miguel and Emma to his study again. This time the atmosphere was different, lighter. I've been thinking, Marcus said, about the future, about what's fair, about what Maria would have wanted. He pushed a document across the desk. I've set up a trust for Emma. Education fully funded through any degree she wants to pursue. When she turns 18, she'll have access to funds that will ensure she never wants for anything. It's not about buying forgiveness or replacing you as her father, Miguel. It's about responsibility. She's my daughter, whether I raised her or not. Miguel looked at the numbers on the paper and felt his breath catch. It was more money than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. It was Emma's future, guaranteed and secure. There's something else, Marcus continued. Emma, would you like to keep your last name? Santos, or would you like to be a Thornton? Or both? It's entirely your choice. Emma thought about it. About her mother, who'd loved 2 men and built 2 lives. About Miguel, who'd raised her with gentle hands and patient love. About Marcus, who was trying in his imperfect way to be part of her life. Can I be Emma Santos Thornton? She asked. Marcus smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in the entire conversation. That's perfect. That evening, as the sun set over the Connecticut hills, Alexander and Emma sat together on the garden wall. Alexander was still learning to process sunsets, to understand why colors shifted and changed as light faded. Do you think my mom knew? He asked. That you'd be the one to help me see? Emma shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe she just knew that love finds a way. That's what people always say, right? Love finds a way. Alexander reached out and took his sister's hand. I'm glad you found us. Even if it's complicated. Even if nothing makes sense. I'm glad. Me too, Emma said. And somewhere in whatever place exists beyond this world, Maria Santos smiled. She'd given her daughter the greatest gift she could. Not wealth or status or a billionaire father. She'd given Emma the words to unlock miracles. The understanding that sometimes the simplest word spoken with love can change everything. The word wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was human. It was connection. It was the invisible thread that tied Emma to Alexander, Marcus to Maria, past to present. Broken to whole, it was mama, a word that meant love, safety, home, and the impossible hope that those we've lost continue to guide us long after they're gone, and in the end that was the real miracle. Not that a blind boy could suddenly see, but that a family could be built from secrets and regrets and the brave honesty of a 7-year-old girl who knew exactly the right word to say at exactly the right moment, because she'd learned it from her mother, who'd learned it from love, who'd whispered it into her daughter's heart years before Emma would need it. Some legacies are measured in money and empires. Others are measured in single words, spoken in moments of grace that echo across time and change everything they touch. Maria's legacy was both, and it was enough.